Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about a controversial subject. Now it's important that I start out by saying that to me this subject is not terribly important, nor is it especially controversial, because the only way we're talking about the subject as controversial is that we're reading classic French literature. There are two other books that I'm going to mention that are more recent, but in general this is just a video on classic French literature. Now, why is it controversial then? I have a friend who right now is exploring his faith, and I studied the Bible some in college, and it's come up because he does not have a strong faith background that basically he'll bounce ideas off me. I'm not a religious person. I don't really have an identity religiously. If I have to say something, I'd say I'm agnostic, but it's not really here or there. If you're looking for a philosopher that I follow, or a theology of sorts, you can look at most of the French post-structuralists. I'm very interested in Derrida, and more recent philosopher I like a lot is the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and he wrote about technology. Okay, so that's me and what I need to say. My friend, who is currently studying the Bible, used to be a new atheist. And when I was about 20 or a bit before that, that was when that movement really had started to take off. So late teens, I was like 17, 18, something like that probably. I was at the time mostly interested in the movement because my friend was, but I never felt any strong connections to it. Some of the claims seem to be made too forcefully for my tastes. It's not that I necessarily disagree with them. So, you go through college and you study your philosophy and your literature, and you kind of develop your own sense of self that way. It's part of what happens when you study a liberal arts curriculum. And yeah, so I have an English degree, and I've basically made myself somebody who studies literature. My friend was bouncing ideas off me more recently, and I was kind of just going around online, and I discovered on YouTube genetically modified skeptic. And I'm saying his name now because I've seen people on YouTube, especially him, reference other YouTubers who they are influenced by. So it makes me feel like I'm not being rude by mentioning this guy. I like his videos okay. They're not always my favorite thing in the world, but I don't watch them religiously. But I figured it would give me some grounds on where to understand my friend from. So him and that interviewer Alex O'Connor, because they're important to kind of a new atheist movement and where my friend is coming from, have made their way onto my YouTube feed. Now, in the past probably month or two, I found a video of genetically modified skeptic talking about Satanism. And I've watched some of his videos and his wife's videos, and I looked into the Satanic temple. Now, keep in mind where I'm coming from. This to me is not offensive, and it's not particularly controversial. It's not something I believe in, but it's just something that is there. And I figured this was a rabbit hole to go down. It would be a lot of fun to look into. And it turns out that they have a very long list of books they recommend. And many of these books that are included in this list are things that I either was interested in as an English major or have since become interested in. And so I'm not going to do any Anglophone literature or reading from this list. They do recommend John Milton, and I've read Paradise Lost, and I loved it. I read it a few years back, but I'm not going to spend the time to reread the book when I've got kind of a theme here for what I'm going to do in this video. And I've definitely read some Byron, not a huge amount, but Lord Byron is interesting. And Shelley, I think, is mentioned also, and I've always liked Shelley. I've never read a great deal of Shelley either, but I love Ozymandias and all those other big poems that he did. And of course, if you like Shelley, you have to put a nod to the hat to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. Especially with some of the recommendations on the list, it's a surprise that Frankenstein doesn't make a mention on there, because he does read classic literature and he does discuss God as we would envision him in, say, the 1700s. So, what this video is going to be about is that the Satanic Temple recommends 4 books that are contemporary readings for the most part. There are 3 contemporary books and a classic French novel called Le Revolt des Anges and The Revolt of the Angels. And then they also recommend Baudelaire and Huysmans. And I believe I'm pronouncing Huysmans' name right. Normally I'm saying Huysmans. And he wrote a book called Là-Bas. And the phrase Là-Bas doesn't mean anything profound. I've seen people online talking about Là-Bas, and they'll call it Là-Bas, and it sounds very foreign in their mouths. And my French is not perfect, as you've been able to tell in these videos, but Là-Bas just means over there. When you want to grab somebody's attention and they're doing something interesting, you can say, "Qu'est-ce que tu fais là-bas?" What are you doing over there? So, Huysmans' novel is just, it's a classic work that deals with Satanism. And Huysmans was converted to Catholicism at the end of his life. And Baudelaire, who we're also going to talk about, led a life filled with various types of sin, but nothing too extreme. But he also took last rites as a Catholic. So these writers who we're reading are not writers who were out promoting religious identities or opinions, really. These things were done for stories. So I guess what I'm saying is that this video, and I've already gone on maybe a bit too long, is really about kind of realistic, for the most part, art that approaches subjects that today we typically associate with horror movies. And those are things like the occult and magic and so on. And the authors of these books, I think the most controversial would have been Baudelaire. But Baudelaire was not really necessarily... He was controversial in 1850. He would not be terribly controversial today. He was considered a pornographer of sorts, and his poetry book Les Fleurs du Mal was banned for a period of time because of so-called immorality. And if you look at this today, we'll get there. One thing I do want to say about Baudelaire is that I, at the moment, have several tattoos. I have them in places that I can keep hidden. I'm kind of an old school guy when it comes to locations you would get tattoos. And I have several tattoos devoted to Baudelaire's poem Au Lecteur, which is the the introductory poem to the Fleurs du Mal. So clearly Baudelaire means a great deal to me. I might go out and get his poetry and images from his poem tattooed on my body. So, now that we've gone through all that, if you're interested, this is not a deep dive into the Satanic Temple's reading list. There are a lot of books mentioned, and some of them are pretty scholarly. But this is a perusal, a thorough looking through of certain things that the temple recommends, but it's looked at through the lens of somebody who is not a part of that temple, doesn't particularly desire membership in the temple, thinks that some of the political activities they've engaged in are interesting, and to the extent that I'm going to defend it, you'll see that when I'm reviewing one of the books, but otherwise, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It was just an interesting flight of fancy for me, something new to look at, and I saw a commonality in interest in the French novel. So if you're here with me, thanks. This intro has gone on a little longer than usual, but for what it's worth, I'm Mark, and this is Several Books. So the books that we're going to look at in chronological order. And there are a few books here that I'm going to make reference to that are not included in the Satanic Temple reading list, but might be included if you were to look into certain things in a scholarly way. Not many of them, but some of them. Our first writer is Baudelaire. And these books, if you can see it, are pretty nice. This is a bit like a Library of America hardcover. If you're familiar with Library of America and you're not Francophone, the publisher is called La Bibliothèque de la Pléiade, and they publish classic French literature. More recently, they have moved into certain things that have a very high likelihood that they're going to be classics. But the classic literature is generally what this is about. Baudelaire is one of the most famous French poets of all time. He died very young. He died when he was 40, or excuse me, late 40s, I think. But basically, what happened with Baudelaire was that he wrote a few poetry books, and they had some controversy around them. He famously was inspired by Poe and was first known as the French translator of Edgar Allan Poe. And although I think that his poetry is much better than Poe's, I've read most of Poe's poetry. I think there are a few poems I'm missing, but you can tell the influence. Very dark and stormy nighty kind of poetry, but at the same time, incredibly lyrical. He's not the type to say it was a dark and stormy night. He would say something much more interesting. After Baudelaire had died, his poetry, I believe, was discovered in England by I forget which poet, but it was like it was somebody from the 1800s, and he had said that the best four poets kind of in the Occident or the Western world, one of them was Baudelaire, and really all he was going off of for that was the Fleurs du Mal. Now Baudelaire wrote Le Fleurs du Mal. He wrote what other books? He's got a number of poems that he translated and things that he wrote in his youth in either this or one of the other books of Baudelaire. In my life, I've read almost 4,000 pages of Baudelaire because I read basically all of his letters that are collected under Bibliothèque de la Pléiade. So, like I said, I'm very interested in this poet independently of all this. This is probably one of my favorite writers of all time. He wrote a book called Le Paradis Artificiel, and that's a book that's basically about his drug use. So as you can see, he's a bit of a debauched guy. He wrote a book called Le Spleen de Paris, or Petit Poème en Prose, also. And that is a book of prose poems, and in its own right has been incredibly influential in poetry. I love all of his books. His three main books collected in this work, despite its length, because this has many young poems and so on, are Le Fleurs du Mal, Spleen de Paris, and Le Paradis Artificiel. The poem that is recommended by the Satanic Temple is, I think it's called Litanies to Satan. And it's only one poem in Le Fleur du Mal. I'm a little unsure as to why they don't include that whole section of the poetry book. There's a section of Le Fleur du Mal called Revolt, and that whole section deals with very religious themes in a dark way. Throughout all of Le Fleur du Mal, there are references to the occult and to darkness, and Satan makes an appearance in a few poems, not as a character really, but he's referenced. It's kind of just a throughout the book thing. So again, I'm not totally sure why the Satanic Temple feels the need to pin that one. But I would really recommend Le Fleur du Mal. Now I'm gonna post a book, or not a book, excuse me. I'm going to post a video by a college professor, I believe from Georgia. I'm not positive of that right now. It's not clear on my head. But it's from one of the southern states, and he teaches world literature. And I'm somebody who's, as I said, I've read a great deal of Baudelaire, and I have looked very heavily into what is called decadent art. And Baudelaire is often considered the progenitor, the forerunner of that artistic movement. And he gives a lecture on Baudelaire. If you're interested in Baudelaire, I would watch that video. Or if you're interested in Wiesmann or any kind of decadent art. It was a very influential movement between 1850, say, and 1900-ish. And much of modern art really came out of touches to this artistic movement, decadence. What I will say is that in the video there are a few poems from Le Fleur du Mal that are read aloud in English. I have not read those English translations. Now, I'm very familiar with Baudelaire in French. He was one of the first writers that I studied in French, hence why I'm so interested in him, because French study is just such a fun hobby to me. It's a real passion. But what I will say is that those poems that they read aloud, I don't want to say the translations are bad, because emotionally they have definite resonance, but they're not very literal translations. So there are some things like cursing in the poem that's read aloud that Baudelaire doesn't really curse. He's writing in 1850-ish or 40 or so. So if he had included jurons, oaths, swear words in French, they would have been censored. He would have faced criticism for that in a legal way. So he doesn't really do that. Regardless, the book was still controversial. But if you're interested in French poetry at all, Baudelaire is a great place to start. Le Fleur du Mal. I just reread it, and I'm not sure what all to say about the book. Most of the poems are on the shorter end. A favorite of mine is Le Vin de l'Assassin, and the Wine of the Assassin, Le Vin de l'Assassin, and he's very good with sonnets that are not Shakespearean sonnets. There's just a whole lot of stuff in Baudelaire. The other thing about Baudelaire is that he was an art critic, and if you're very interested in more classic views of art, one of the main reasons I think Baudelaire has stuck around so long is that anybody who's really studying his poetry has the ability to read his criticism, and his theories of art, and this is 1840-ish, are so fleshed out that you can see exactly what he does and does not like in art. And you can see a lot of very interesting things. He's fascinated by artifice. He really likes to see when people make things, and for him the entire art world is about making something out of raw material. But if you want more information in that, you can check the world literature video that I've included in the description for this video. The second video that we're going to look at, or the second book that we're going to look at, is Là-Bas. My lighting is a little off here. You can't see the cover very well. I love this novel. Huysmans is a very classical writer. You're getting a kind of conventional narrative with the beginnings of kind of like a sensation idea, a subjectivity in the writing. So I would say that maybe stylistically, the kind of writers who would be like Huysmans are those 19th century greats, people like Henry James and so on. If you like French writing, this is a great book. I do really like this book. The opening quote for this video is taken from this novel, and the novel is about a man named Berthold who he wants to write a book about a figure named Gilles de Rais. Now, I have two other books that I'm going to talk about with this novel, but let's just finish talking about this for a moment first. This book is about a guy who becomes interested in Gilles de Rais, and he's interested in all of the mythos around Gilles de Rais. And for my part, what really makes the novel worth going through are the meditations on Gilles. And there are some other things in the book. He does talk about a black mass because Gilles was a Satanist supposedly, but he's while he's doing research into the satanic arts, the dark arts, he becomes friends with a few people and essentially has the opportunity to attend a black mass. For those of you who are not aware, this is a satanic ritual wherein a host is desecrated. And if you look for this online, what you're going to see is a lot of talk about the Black Mass. And there's some stuff that happens in the Black Mass. Honestly, for me, it was kind of a lackluster. It was certainly interesting. The whole book, because you're aware of it, you're wondering, like, where's the Black Mass? Where's the Black Mass? I want to see the darkness. I want to see, this is like a horror film, you know? But it's not really as central to the novel, I think, as you may expect. It definitely happens. There's a speech. I forget what you'd call that, a eulogy of some sort that's given. That's beautiful in its own right. You understand what I'm saying? But there's some sexual conduct that seems to be cited online a lot. And if you're used to reading classic novels that aren't totally PG rated, you're not really seeing a whole lot in that way that you might expect. It's really not that graphic. This is certainly no book by the Marquis de Sade. In general, I would say this is like I said, it's a great novel. What keeps me coming back to it is Gilles de Rais. And we're going to talk about Gilles de Rais right now. Now, I have two books that I've read about Gilles de Rais. This one is not specifically about him, and this one is specifically about him. Now, if you're interested in darkness in literature, there is a writer, a French writer, I'm sure people who are watching this may already be aware, named Georges Bataille. And Georges Bataille was sometimes called a theoretician of evil. He wrote a book that's literary criticism called, I think it's translated as Evil in Literature. I've read a lot of Georges Bataille. His ideas about transgression in literature are fascinating. I think if you start to think about it, many of your favorite books, when drama occurs, you'll realize what's really going on is somebody is performing some type of transgression, either metaphorically or consciously against another character. So we're going to start with this because this is older, and this is basically a true crime book about Gilles de Rais. Now, Gilles de Rais was he was a compat of Joan of Arc, and he assisted Joan of Arc. So this is like the 1600s or whatever, the 1400s. This is so long ago, I don't even remember really. But what you've got is that this guy, after his time with Joan of Arc, became a murderer on the level of Bluebeard. And Bluebeard is referenced in Là-Bas also. And Bluebeard is a famous murderer from 500 years ago, and he killed a bunch of innocent women. And it was a big thing. Kurt Vonnegut has a novel about Bluebeard. Bluebeard's only makes a brief appearance in the book, but the title of the book is Bluebeard. Gilles de Rais is like that, except that he apparently killed mostly kids. And he apparently practiced all sorts of Satanism. And if you read this book, you get, first, it's a history of Gilles de Rais, and this is English, or this is available in English, my copy's in French. And then you get a collection of true testimonies from the proceedings. And these are the transcribed papers from the testimony. And Gilles de Rais was I believe burned at the stake. So that's kind of what happens. You get a history of that, and then you have people testifying that he was performing this black art and that black art and so on and so forth, and it was terrible. And yeah. If you're interested in this kind of thing, or in Georges Bataille at all, this is a worthwhile true crime read. It was a very enjoyable book. But in this book, Gilles de Rais is exactly as terrible as he sounds. So this is written by Georges Bataille, who is not a historian, He's a big intellectual. He's kind of a figure like Borges, sort of, in the sense that he was so broad ranging and everything, and so intelligent. But this is as sensational as it gets. So if you were to ask George Bataille, he would tell you the story of Gilles de Rais that's basically in Là-Bas. Now, I'm going to talk about this book. I don't know if you can see that. It's called Ritual Magic. And this is from a series of books that's published by Penn State. And the book series is called Magic and History. Now, I learned about this book series from another YouTuber. The guy who does Esoterica, Dr. Justin Sledge, I think is his name. Everybody online seems to watch this guy. He makes great content. It's a lot of fun to watch if you're looking for something a bit off the beaten path. But his channel Esoterica has it has a book list. At least on some videos it's offered. And this is one of the books that he recommends. I haven't read extensively from his book list. I've read a few books on it. Things that are generally very accessible compared to the more esoteric stuff for the Esoterica. But if you saw the video when I was taking books off the shelves, you'll see that I've read a few books in this series. Now, this book spends some time on Gilles de Rais, and God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The woman who wrote this book was basically of the opinion that a lot of the testimony about Gilles de Rais was really more about how he was a terrible overlord of sorts. He was like a duke or something. You know, he was one of these royals, like a lesser royal, but who still has tremendous power over a group of people and kind of his own little domain. And he was known for basically being terrible and stealing things from people. And when I say things, I'm not talking like he stole someone's watch. I'm talking like he stole someone's land. He stole someone's farm. He killed somebody under this direction or did this or that. And so she thinks that essentially what ended up happening was that people were fed up with him. And the main thing that they could get to stick was this kind of satanic, worshipping and murdering of children and so on. So she basically casts doubt on the whole story. Now, as a work of folklore, I'm somebody who follows this. I'll say that. When I think of Gilles de Rais, I tend to take the more scientific approach to history, which is what she's got here. She's got more of a critical eye. But the book by Bataille is still really good. It's interesting folklore of sorts, and there are actual historical documents in here. It is available in English if you're interested. But this Magic and History book, the Ritual Magic book, does discuss Gilles de Rais, and yeah, she kind of casts doubt on the whole conventional story. Now, I know I've gotten off topic for Wiesma a bit, but what I do want to say is that Là-Bas is a great book, and that the information about Gilles de Rais and the writing of his novel by Dertol, that kind of keeps the crux of the book going. So, despite all of the black mass and the this, that, and the other thing, you've really got a guy writing a piece of historical fiction, doing research into historical fiction, and or into history, and obscure ideas about history. And it's fascinating But when you start looking into it with the contemporary eye for history, you realize that, well, at 1900 or so, when the book was written, 1890 or whatever it was, that might have been the Gilles that they knew. But in reality, this guy was probably a horrible man, but horrible for different reasons than that he was performing satanic rites and murdering and abusing people and all this other stuff. But Là-Bas is definitely very good. Yeah, we'll go with that. So the next book that we're going to talk about is Le Revolt des Anges. This is my copy. This is a French copy. Now, this is one of the books that really got me interested in reading this whole French thing as it was, and rereading some things. This is by Anatole France, and he was a Nobel Prize winner. I think he won around 1920. And I think this book was written in like 1914 or so, something like that. And this is basically a sort of fairy tale. And in the fairy tale, or the mythic story of sorts, there's an angel who is watching over somebody, and the guy he's watching over is the son of somebody with basically the world's best library. They don't say that exactly. It's one of the best private libraries in the world, is what is said. But it's not to say that the library has access to the most complete number of tomes. It's just that this library has been exquisitely curated. And what ends up happening is this angel starts going through the library and reading in the library. And while he's reading in the library, he essentially has a complete loss of faith. There's a lot of stuff from the Gnostic Gospels in here. I don't know a lot about the Gnostic Gospels. I've seen things on YouTube about them in the past and so on. But it's not really my cup of tea, so to speak. But yeah, we get, for instance, a sort of entire world history in 3 or 4 chapters from the perspective of a deity. From an angelic point of view. We've got a lot of people who are these angels who are trying to revolt against God, and who are basically saying that there's so much injustice in the world, and these things are not handled appropriately. I don't know exactly what else to say about that. I think the best way to take the novel is, as I said, it's a sort of almost fairy tale. I thought it was a great novel. Anatole France is not a figure who's associated with darkness. I need to make that clear. I don't know who's watching this, but Anatole France was essentially like a enlightened Frenchman at the turn of the 20th century. And I would recommend this completely independently of this video. I'm not surprised at all that an organization of people is like, hey, this is a great book, The Revolt des Anges, the Revolt of Angels, by the Nobel Prize winner. If you win a Nobel Prize, basically everything you've written is probably pretty decent. I've read a lot of books by Nobel Prize winners, and I can't name many that were not very good. But this is a good book. I would hesitate to lump this in with anything that would say Satanism as such. It's not really in the book. The book is a story about angels who are revolting, but this is essentially more of like a enlightened early 20th century thinker's work, and he's using these biblical figures to explore different ideas, and at different moments to stand in for different schools of thought. But yeah, it's sort of like a much edgier and cooler version of Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. So, great book. Okay, so The next book that we're going to talk about is Speak of the Devil. And we're going to talk about both the satanic books. They're not satanic. They're both more of like a history almost, or pseudo-history. This is a religious ethnography by a scholar of religion. I'm pretty sure this guy has a degree from Harvard. He teaches, I think, in California. He's in a few YouTube videos. And you know, he's an expert in that. So he's not a Satanist, but he's writing about the Satanic Temple. Now, the Satanic Temple recommends 4 main books for the people who are following that. And the other one, there's the Revolt des Anges, there's this book, there's this shorter book on Satanism, and there's a very long book by Steven Pinker. And I don't know if anybody knows who Steven Pinker is, but he's a liberal intellectual who's not interested in anything like Satanism at all. His name's popped up next to like Jordan Peterson and stuff before, so it's really kind of a surprise that you're grouping all of these things together, but it is what it is. So, Speak of the Devil. This was a good book. It was like a history book that really starts around like 2013. And I don't have a huge amount to say about it. It basically just looks at all of the differences in faith, and he kind of gives this accounting of the Satanic Temple and how it started really as a political organization to counteract certain more theocratic ideals that they saw being pushed in state government. The 2 founders of the Satanic Temple are a guy named, I think, Malcolm Jerry and Lucian Graves, and those are both pen names or pseudonyms. They're both Harvard educated, apparently. The name Jerry from Malcolm Jerry is the last name of a very famous French writer named Alfred Jerry, who was a surrealist and wrote comedies. He's a funny comedies. They're not, I don't know. What I wanted to show with Speak of the Devil is this little book here called Discussion sur le péché. And that is discussions on the sinning, or on the sin, by Bataille. And this was an interview, this was an intellectual conversation, like a round table of sorts that was transcribed, and like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir are in it. And in it, Bataille discusses his theoretical framework and his aesthetics. And one thing that he says is that he holds in his mind for an aesthetic interest evil, essentially. And he says that you can only have that evil as a counterpoint to a Christian view. He's not like, basically what he's saying is that you kind of can't have one without the other. And in the context of the conversation for this, and it's strange because this is basically for Bataille fans, that seems to be not the most convincing argument for Bataille's standpoint when you've got somebody like Sartre right next to him. And Sartre's, hammering away and doing Sartre things and being an intellectual. But it's interesting because in Speak of the Devil, essentially, you only have the Satanic Temple doing things when the Christian movement, the more theocratic wing of a certain type of Christian, it's not an all Christian thing, are pushing certain political views. So it's interesting because the book seems to have that idea by Bataille in itself without necessarily realizing it. But there are a lot of interesting things in the book. There are tenets to the Satanic faith, and there are all these beliefs and how things have evolved and how things have changed. The way that all of the church is really kind of a left of center political apparatus, and there are things like that. The last book that I'm going to talk about is the little book of Satanism, and this was recommended on the site as well. I got my copy very cheap. I think it was like $15, so it's not very cheap considering it's only 140 pages. But this basically feels like the Laycock book, the Speak of the Devil book, but the light version of it. And this was written by a blogger named La Carmina. It's okay. It's just that if you're going to be reading one of these books on it, you should probably be reading Speak of the Devil before the other thing. Okay, so I'm not really going to be ranking the books this time. Ranking Baudelaire for me is absurd because I've read thousands of pages of him, including personal letters. So you know that I think he's just all good. I've said nothing but praise about Là-Bas, and I think it's a great novel. And Revolt is the same thing. It's a great novel. As far as the books on Satanism goes, they're more educational material. The book itself on Satanism is a little lackluster. It's very short. But the Laycock book is a very solid book, a nonfiction work discussing a much lesser known religion. And it's very clear that the author is not saying like he's, embracing the church, so to speak. He's saying that this is an interesting theological movement, an interesting religion that he's had the opportunity to study, and this is what he's taken from histories and interviews and so on. So I don't know. The classic stuff is all S tier. The Laycock book, let's give it an A, and the La Carmina book, let's give it a B. It's really not here or there. I think this video has gone on a few minutes longer than normal, but I do think it's within an acceptable time frame. I hope you guys enjoyed that I kind of went down this rabbit hole. I really enjoyed reading Le Revolt des Anges. The other stuff was already kind of in my wheelhouse. So I didn't really discover new books, but I saw that these books were being grouped in a certain way, and I thought it might be interesting to look at them in that light. Alright everyone, thanks for everything. Please like and subscribe. I hope you guys have a great day. Several books out.